I may probably make a lot more money for the amount of work and overhead and all that, but I'm not feeding that many people.
Well, but I mean, I don't think that's necessarily a goal you need to be concerned about. Feeding people, I mean, farmers have for too long, I hear it now. I hear people make comments about, it's our job to feed the world, as though we're supposed to be doing it for charity to feed people. That's an offset of our business. We should be concerned about the people that buy our products. Absolutely. We should raise quality food. We should, but it is ultimately in somebody else's hands as far as, how many people get fed. It's an economic thing. Now, for a while, back in the mid 20th century through the late 20th century, the farm program was much more significant to the farmer. And so I feel like there was probably an obligation as a result of trying to do things and produce as much as possible. But since that's pretty much gone, we've been thrown back into a 100% free market situation. It's a business, and any grower, you have to pay your bills, you have to make a living first, and that's really your primary concern. If you have one customer that bought enough to make your business viable, what's wrong with that? You can grow and go into it, but I don't think you have a responsibility to try to. You can make it available, and if people, for whatever reason, whether it's education or affluence, and whatever it is, their motivation for buying your product will be the grease that lubes the wheels on you expanding and doing more and more.
Right. If the demand is there.
If the demand is there.
Yeah.
Then you try to meet that demand.
And I've noticed that people are already going to Whole Foods and looking for that high quality food, and they just, it's not what it used to be. It's like,
no, of course it isn't.
And people realize that. And I noticed, like in North Raleigh, people they don't know a farmer. They don't know how to find a farmer. They want to connect directly to people that are growing their food. They just don't have access to it.
And in our whole system, I think the thing that people have to understand about our food system is that it's been driven by economics for the past X number of years. It's been driven by economics. Meaning, my sisters used to send me articles occasionally about, a different type of grain that was grown in South America that's such a high quality grain or something. Amaranth is one of them, possibly, and there was another one that was grown in the high Andes and so forth. And compared to corn and wheat, it was so much better. It had a better nutritional profile and so forth and so on. And while all that may be true, the reason corn, soybeans, wheat have been the staple crops is because they're the most productive, the most efficient, they're most easily handled, they're the most easily adapted to mechanization. If you look at the amaranth seed, it's a little tiny seed. It's very difficult, much more difficult. I mean, I'm sure they can be made, but it's much more difficult, much more expensive to handle that little tiny seed than it is a large kernel of corn or a kernel of wheat. And so that's why the crops that we get, I'm sure there are crops that are better quality grain food sources than, corn, soybeans, and wheat. But from an economic standpoint, they're not.
I think a lot about the sustainable aspect of certain foods that we grow and eat, because even if something could be more sustainable or better for the environment or higher nutrient density or whatever, it's not what people are used to. And I think there's a struggle with that for sure. Like I know with, for example, like poultry, you could raise geese on pasture, 100% grass-fed and totally regenerative, but no one eats geese.
Right. No, there are lots of things. I mean, people talk about goat meat being really a great quality.
Goat meat?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
But that's just not something.
No one's gonna eat goat.
Right. I've never eaten it. I've never tried it.
I've had it before, but
I would be more willing now to try it than I say would have been 20 years ago. I'm much more open-minded about doing things.
Yeah. But I don't think everyone is that way, because I think a lot of people just eat what they eat, and that's. Yeah. And people don't want to change the.
Well, there has to be some motivation to it. There has to be some reason for them to look at it.
Right.
Again, cattle are our primary, cattle and pork and poultry that we have currently are our primary sources of meat, simply because they're the most efficient. I mean, we dabbled in sheep a little bit when our son was young and he was showing in the 4-H clubs, and so we bought a small flock of sheep. But then we started lambing these sheep, and so if you have a cow and you have to calve one cow, and you produce a calf that will in 18 to 24 months have a 700-pound carcass, including the bones. But I mean, after how many sheep do you have to lamb to produce the same number of pounds of meat. And, those are all considerations. Again, that's why cattle and pork are the primary sources of meat that we have and we consume, is because they're the most productive.
Yep.
You can raise the most pounds of price. Well, there's nothing else that produces more pounds of protein per acre than soybeans. There's nothing else that produces more pounds or more calories per acre than corn. And so when you're looking at that kind of a situation, that is what drove those commodities to become the dominant ones. And it doesn't hurt it that, corporate America kind of latched onto that as well, and that's where all the products go to. That's where all the research is. And so, but there are opportunities to slowly break those molds if people want that. You talk about North Raleigh and people wanting to find farmers. There's also a mindset they have to understand, and I had this happen when I used to do some direct sales. People, do you have sweet corn? Yep. I'll call you back in a week or two. Well, no, I've got the sweet corn now. In a week or two, what I've got now, if I don't sell it, will be gone. And in a week or two, I may not have any. People, and I run into this when I tried doing some direct sales, like to restaurants and the chefs, which are good folks, and they're trying to, but they can't get it. They're so used to being able to pick up the phone and call a distributor. I want X number of this and X number of that, and I want it tomorrow or the next day, whatever it is. And you just can't operate that way when you're dealing with small farmers, like yourself. What you're producing, when you have it, you have it. And if you want it fresh, now I can do a better job of giving them a heads up a week or two ahead of time. That's something we need to work on as growers. The problem with that is Mother Nature has such an impact on it. It's very difficult. I have a very difficult time calling somebody and saying, my crop will be ready next week, because if it suddenly turns kind of cool and cloudy, it's going to slow it down. If it turns sunny and hot, it's going to speed it up. Heat units drive the maturity of most crops. And so it's very difficult for me. And plus, the first blooms seem like they take forever to turn into a fruit. And then once it gets producing, it's almost overnight the way it turns in. So I have difficulty giving that kind of heads up, because if I tell somebody I'm going to have something, I want to make sure I have it. So we kind of have to feel our way through on that.
I think there's a shift with restaurants now. There's more restaurants that are starting to realize how it actually works. Mm-hmm. And so some of the chefs that I work with, like they're in flux, like their menus are always changing.
Yeah.
And I think that's the way it needs to be, and also the way that, people want fresh food. So, but it's hard. Like I know, like I was giving something to a chef like every week for a while, and they put it on their menu, and it's a certain salad that features my stuff, and then I don't have this for another 3 weeks, and they have to change it.
Yeah. And that's just the reality of dealing with. I tried to work with a restaurant, a group of restaurants in Raleigh that had common ownership. And, they wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to have the fresh stuff, but they wanted to be able to have it when they wanted it and pay for it the same way. Mm-hmm. They wanted to pay the same thing for fresh stuff as they were paying for it coming out of a warehouse. And so we never really got to any kind of a agreement on that. I've talked to at least one of our distributors that distributes to a lot of restaurants and said, I think it would be really beneficial for you to have a dinner, have a meeting, invite all your chefs, find a common time when you can get all these people together and educate them. Give them an idea about what it takes to grow food. I think there's so much disconnect amongst aspects of our food chain that don't know what the other parts of the food chain are doing. And that causes, causes the gears not to mesh like they need to mesh to make it work really well.
Right. I feel obligated to educate the chefs too, because and they want to know. They don't unless they have the interaction with farmers, they don't know.
Oh, I find it all the time. I meet somebody that is just stunned.
These are customers of ours, right? And yeah.
Well, they're stunned when I tell them how things actually work on a farm or how things grow. Things that I guess because I've been exposed to it since I was old enough to pay attention on the farm growing up here. We were in the dairy business from 1991 to 2007. And I was very active in the dairy organizations, and we were trying to get a Southern Dairy Compact passed through Congress so that we could have a regional milk pricing system for fluid milk, which would have helped stabilize the market in the Southeast, and it would have contributed towards sustaining and maintaining the local production of milk. Right now in North Carolina, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50% at least, maybe even more by now, of the milk you buy actually comes from out of state. It just isn't a local product because the dairies have gone away. And so we were trying to get that. Obviously, it was our own self-interest. We were trying to get the price of milk stable and at a point we could make a profit. I went to Washington on a number of occasions to educate, lobby our congressmen and senators. And we got really good response from everybody on our delegation in North Carolina. They were very supportive of it. We went and it was a delegation of, I don't know, a dozen or so dairy farmers from around the state who went to Washington. And if you were meeting with the congressman from your district, you went up and spoke, right, as the head of the group because you were their constituent. And I'd already met with Eva Clayton, who was our congressman at the time. And so then we were with another congressman. And I think I remember what congressman it was, but I don't know. I'm not going to say, except that it was a congressman from a more urban district in North Carolina. And so I was kind of in the back of the room talking. And you know, most of the congressional aides are relatively young. A lot of them were straight out of college. So anyway, this young man came up to me, and I don't know what position he had with this congressman, what his specialty was. But we started talking, and he said, you know, I never really thought about milk coming from a farm. I thought it was manufactured in a plant like Pepsi and Coke. You know, this is somebody who was obviously well educated, working for a congressman who didn't realize where milk actually comes from. You know, and you and I, we laugh about people that say, oh, food comes from the grocery store. But there is a segment, and a growing segment of our population that literally thinks food comes from a grocery store. And that disconnect is troubling. It's troubling for their own well-being. It's troubling for the future of the country, how we produce food, because those same people vote. I hope they do. And they vote for people that make policy that impacts how your food is grown. I wanted to say one thing about the last video we did, Josh. I was very touched by a lot of the comments that were made. Yeah. I think very flattered. I think, you know, maybe some of it was undue flattery. But, I think so, Jeff. Well, I mean, I appreciate that. I think there was one comment in there about us, you know, 450 acres, and we're not a small farm. And I think that's another misconception that people have. And I run into that here, even locally, when I work with groups that are trying to develop markets for small farms. We are a small farm compared to agriculture. You know, we would be on the bottom end of the scale of conventional agriculture. And I think there were some comments that said there are plenty of growers in the Midwest that have thousands of acres, even tens of thousands of acres. You can draw your own conclusions. People can draw their own conclusions as whether that's a good or bad thing. I personally think the country and the world would be better off with more people who know how to grow food and more people growing a more diversified crop mix. I think one of the problems we run into is these large growers get locked into planting certain commodities, and they can't respond to markets. You know, somebody has got $1 million of investment in equipment to raise corn and soybeans, or one or the other. He can't decide not to grow that next year, or he can't decide to change to another crop because he has no choice. You know, if he's set up to raise 5,000 acres of soybeans, he's going to raise 5,000 acres of soybeans, whether they're $5 a bushel or $15 a bushel. So agriculture does a very poor job of responding to market pressure in the short run. What happens is you end up running people having bloodletting. You stretch that rubber band and stretch it till it finally breaks. And that's how we respond to markets. When the price goes down, and we're in a current price slump right now, and there are a record number of farmers going bankrupt. And so that is how the system is set up, that we end up responding to market signals rather than, you know, I would feel like in 50 years ago or 75 years ago, farms were smaller. They were more diverse. They had multiple income streams. You had a farm in the Midwest that raised corn and soybeans and wheat and oats, and they had a swine operation, and they had a cow herd. And if one of those commodities wasn't making any money, the other ones would make up the difference, or they could shift on a given year how they were doing it. And now with these particularly large operations that are almost monocropping, and there are some who are raising primarily corn, for example, year after year after year. They're going to raise the crop, whether it's corn, whether it's $2 a bushel or $8 a bushel. You have a widespread drought, or like this year, although this year markets haven't responded to 19 million acres of cropland in this country not being planted this year. It represents about a 12% drop in corn and soybean production, and the markets have gone down.
So there's less production and the price went down?
Yes. When you cut yourself out of the largest single market in the entire world, then that's what happens.
So you just mentioned sort of the business strategy of diversification on farms. Is there sort of an ecological or environmental reason for doing that too?
Oh, sure. I mean, we farming, the old school way of farming, one of the ways you dealt with pests was the crop rotation. Because different, pests, whether it be nematodes or insect pests, they tend to be generally specific to a crop. So if you have a piece of land and you're growing a crop that have a pest problem, relative to that crop, and you put a different crop on the next year, well, it's going to break some of that cycle. It's going to, rather than feeding that pest to continue to grow, you break it down and it makes it more manageable. And it also has benefits just from a fertility standpoint, because different crops pull different levels of different soil nutrients out.
And mixed farms with animals too, right?
And animals as well, because animals, you have a source of cow manure, which is a great fertilization tool. So when I got in the dairy business, my goal was to market our crops through milk. And we, of course, would scrape the lots and spread the manure on the corn crop and so forth. Now the dairy industry is geared towards these huge operations that just produce milk. They buy all their feed. And then they spread their cattle waste around. They have to do something with it. But it's not a self-contained operation. The economics have just driven people to be specialized. Mm-hmm. On a diversified farming operation, you have to probably have a more diverse array of equipment. And with equipment, being so expensive and so geared towards huge production, that's a roadblock into doing that.
All right, Jeff, so I got a question after your last video with me, and it says, the question is, how do we increase the number of food-aware, responsible consumers so that small sustainable agriculture can become the norm? And I think a lot of people are struggling with what to do at this point when they realize what's going on and they want to make a difference. And I've talked to you about this before, and like my small farm and how I feel like it's so inconsequential that I produce such a small amount of food. But what can we do as farmers, as consumers, as people in society? What can we do, you think?
Well, as I said a minute ago, what you do isn't inconsequential. It's no more inconsequential or less than what I do, and I probably am 100 times larger on a produce operation or something to that scale than what you do. Still, in the scope of everything, it's nothing. But it's the same thing I would say to people who say, well, I don't bother voting because that's one vote out of 100 million or whatever. If everybody said that, there'd be nobody voting. And so everybody has to do what they can do on their personal level and encourage other people. So if you want to encourage other people, that's something you can do. I don't think it's realistic to expect that we're going to change the food system ever to the point that we have all local sustainable foods. Because the problem is the majority of our food is produced hundreds and hundreds of miles away from population centers. You can't have enough small farms around New York to feed the city. You can't even have enough small farms around Raleigh, North Carolina to feed the city. You could take a portion of it. You have to have major food production areas, and they're going to be a long ways away from population centers. So that's why we produce a lot of grain, because grain stores and it's easily hauled. And then you can take that closer to where it's consumed and process it into some kind of a more of an edible food product. That's why we produce so much meat, because you can raise that away and you can haul a concentrated nutrient source to the cities. You have to step back and realize what it's going to take, unless you want to take and turn 10% of the population back into farmers, which is not going to happen. That's like turning the clock back 100 years or more. And unfortunately, no matter how much you may want that to be the case, that's not going to happen. But if you want the availability and the option for you, if you choose to do that, and we live in a country that, one of our bedrocks is that we have the option to choose how we live our lives. And so what you want to have is the option, if you want to have that type of food, that it's available to you, that you're not forced. And we have, up until recently, kind of been forced into eating what corporate America wanted you to eat. And so this is a kind of an uprising against that. And for people, there's a large percentage of the population that don't care about this. And you have to recognize that you still have a significant portion of the population that is looking at economics alone. I mean, when you look at the income disparity in this country, you have a huge number of people who are hand to mouth from paycheck to paycheck. And their concern is how much does it cost to buy their food. They don't have the luxury of being concerned about the quality of it and the freshness and the locality and the sustainability of it. They're just trying to find enough calories and protein to sustain themselves and their families. And that's just the unfortunate reality of it.
Do you think a lot of this stems from the fact that over decades or generations that food has just become so cheap in the United States?
Sure. I mean, it's been said it's been abundant beyond belief. There are parts of the world now in which people work all day just to feed themselves, or to feed themselves, clothe themselves, and have a shelter. And it's a significant portion of this country, percentage of our population in this country that essentially do that. By the time they pay their mortgage payment or their rent, and they pay for the grocery bills and so forth, and their clothing, they don't have anything left. So we do have a percentage of this, but in other parts of the world, the vast majority of the population just works just to survive. Whereas we have a large segment here, a certain, that have a lot of extra money to do other things with. And those are the people that have concerns. They have the luxury of being concerned about the quality of the food they eat. They have the luxury of being able to do that. I think there are some major changes that can be made to the big picture as well. As I said last time, we're skating on thin ice with the way we're allowing agriculture to go, with fewer and fewer people who have the knowledge and the experience to produce food. And I think it's risky to do that. And the way we're very specialized, the way we've lost a lot of the diversity and diversification in farming operations.
So essentially, vote with your dollar.
Well, you vote with your dollar, sure. If you go to a grocery store and you don't see what you want there, go find the manager and say, I really wish you would have more local foods, more local produce. I really wish you would do this, or I'm going to start shopping somewhere else. Or just go to the places that have it and shop there. And, just the business cycle will weed out the ones who don't want to, or they'll start doing it. And we've seen that. Local grocery chains trying to do more local advertising that. It's having an impact. I mean, it has allowed me to stay in business, the local foods movement. If I were just trying to compete against some of the huge produce operations, and I didn't have any advantage of being quote unquote local and being small, I couldn't compete. And it's not so much competing on dollar. I don't receive that much of a premium per se, but I have access to market. And the buyers would obviously rather pick up the phone and call somebody who can deliver a tractor trailer load than to fool around with coming by and picking up a couple pallets from me a couple times a week. But they do so because it's a marketing thing, because I am local and we're a small grower, and it's something that consumers are demanding. So that's a very good thing, and I appreciate that.
So as consumers are trying to become more educated, and we've talked about this before, is finding reliable information.
In my adult life, the internet has come into fruition. And the amount of information that is out there, everybody knows who's having access to it, it's just mind-boggling to me. There's so much misinformation on the internet. And it's on a wide variety of topics. But we're talking about food here, so we'll concentrate on that. It bothers me sometimes to go in there and Google various blogs or websites that talk about food, how much misinformation there is out there, wrong information. And I'm going to be very magnanimous and say it's just that they don't know better. I would hope it's not malicious intent to say something that they know is wrong, but there are a lot of people. I mean, we have a huge knowledge gap in this country about what you eat and how food is produced. And there are people that make comments on what they know, and their intention may be genuinely good, but they just don't know what they're talking about. And they make comments. I see it all the time. I see it made to me. I've had some of our customers who have made comments about feeds and livestock and so forth, and I've had to say, no, that's not really how it is, when they talk about commercial agriculture. My wife is a high school English literature teacher, and we've talked any number of times about, our education system in some ways is really letting the country down, because we have students who still can graduate without having basic math skills and literacy in terms of really, but for people to learn about food, about how food is produced, about how food has influenced really the course of history. I mean, countries that had access to food and fed themselves better became the powerful countries, and foods in which people struggled to feed themselves became, were the weak countries. Most people just don't understand, and it's just they never had access to the information. I mean, it's not that they were willfully ignorant, but they just are somewhat ignorant on how we feed ourselves.
So that's a big undertaking for sure, but I think as a former teacher myself, I mean, I realize that could be extremely powerful, introducing children to the knowledge and information about food and farming and stuff at a younger age so that they're aware of it, because most people are so disconnected from a farm.
As far as talking about what people as individuals, you can vote, number one, for politicians who are cognizant and open to the idea of how legislation impacts the food system, who are willing to look at the farm bill and say we need to maybe offer more support for smaller farms, for some things like, I don't see any reason why we shouldn't have limits on how much whatever farm payments are out there. Why are we paying people to farm 10,000? I mean, is that really what the farm bill should be geared towards? Well, you can target payments. You can be open to increasing crops that are eligible for farm payments. Produce crops get very little of anything out of the farm bill. So how you vote, but also, like you said earlier, Josh, vote with your pocketbook. Patronize stores that have a supply of local produce. Patronize restaurants that buy local, that has chefs that actually, there's chain restaurants typically, they're chain restaurants. They all serve the same thing. Whereas freestanding restaurants that have a chef who can change the menus based on what's available. It's not natural to have strawberries in North Carolina in December. If you get strawberry shortcake in December, the strawberries are coming from California or somewhere in Central America. If that's what you want, that's fine. But if you realize that that's what you're buying, vote with your pocketbook and choose to do something else.